Thank you, Travis. Appreciate it. Well, I'm going to be speaking on difficult Old Testament texts. Just out of curiosity, what are some difficult texts that you all have come across in the Old Testament, or perhaps people have brought up to you? Maybe you didn't even see it in the Old Testament. What sorts of things have you all come across? Feel free to just jump in. Yep. Psalm. Okay, Psalm 82:1. Any passage dealing with slavery. Got a few hands here. 3 in a row. Go ahead. Joshua and all the Canaanite stuff.
The passage in the Torah where it said that somebody was picking up sticks, and so God commanded him to be killed.
Okay, all right. Jacob wrestling with God. Okay, got a few hands up here. Yes, front row. Okay, Amnon and Tamar, difficult passage. Good to keep in mind that sometimes when things are in the Bible, sometimes they're merely descriptive rather than prescriptive, so keep that in mind. But yeah, that's a tough passage. Yes, second row. The whole book of Job. Yes, okay. Sure. Yep. God's hardening Pharaoh's heart. Okay. Okay, Pharaoh hardened his heart. Okay, yeah. Genesis 1. Okay. Don't know all this behind it, but okay, Genesis 1. All right, got a few hands up right here, and then we'll go to the back. Yep. Okay, right up here. Hold on. First right here, and then just first here, and then the back. Yep. Sodom and Gomorrah. Are you talking about Jephthah in Judges? Okay, Judges. Yeah, so yeah, the Jephthah offering up his daughter who comes out to greet him. Addison. Oh, sorry, these two guys and then Addison, then we'll finish up. Yeah. Okay. Polygamy. Okay. Okay, all right. Okay, all right. Two more. Okay, Alex and then Shelley. Yep. 1 Samuel 15, the Amalekites. Okay, Shelley. When the sun stood still. Okay. There are 3 different ways of looking at that, but yeah, okay, thank you. And then one more. Okay, yeah, so God's using wicked nations to bring judgment on less wicked nations, right? So, okay, all right, one really last one, yes. Okay, all right. Well, you all have hit on some very notable passages, things that are challenging, and we work through some of them perhaps to some degree, and we think, oh man, I wish I could do a little bit more digging. Well, I've tried to do a good bit of digging into these texts, and I've done a trilogy. One of them is co-authored, but it's a book is called Is God a Moral Monster? The second one, written with Matthew Flanagan, Did God Really Command Genocide? The third book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? Spoiler alert, answer to all 3 of those is no. But if you're interested, a couple of the books are out here. So the Vindictive Bully and the Moral Monster books are there. And it covers things like the wars in Canaan. It covers God's hardening Pharaoh's heart. It covers some of those difficult psalms, like the imprecatory psalms, those harsh-sounding psalms. And God says, "Break their teeth." And what about Psalm 137, where it says, "Blessed is the one who dashes your little ones against the rocks." What's that all about? Well, at least 4 different interpretations on that. So I go into a lot of detail on a number of these passages and would certainly encourage you to take a look at them. I'll be speaking on some themes from my book. By the way, here we go. How do you like this? I don't know if you've ever seen Far Side cartoons, but God is getting ready to hit the smite key as the piano is being lowered down, and this hapless young man is walking underneath it. Is that it? Is that how it works? God just is ready to hit the smite key as people are walking, beneath pianos or whatever. So a lot of people have that impression. God is just arbitrary, capricious, irrational. If something just he doesn't like, he just lashes out, and no rhyme or reason. Well, these are the books that I mentioned. And what I'd like to do, as I said, is talk about a few themes from my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? Again, just a few things, can't really cover a lot, but wanted to also leave some room for questions at the end. So we'll try to move with unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, and majestic instancy as we walk through some difficult passages. I wanted to give you some of the nuggets, some of the key themes, but we're not going to be able to go into a lot of detail, but hopefully this will give you an idea of ways in which you can address this topic, have something of a grasp on what may be behind these judgments, these harsh texts. But I think it's important for us to remember that when we're looking at these themes, to keep in mind even some of the things that were mentioned tonight about God's severity being more kind than that of the harshness of human beings. And Paul says in Romans 11:22, he says, "Behold then the kindness and severity of God." And that's a theme that I try to unpack, especially in the book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? That there are people who are called, I call them critics from without, people like the new atheists, Richard Dawkins and so forth, who emphasize the harshness of God, but overlook the kindness of God. And then there are what I call critics from within, people who I think, rather than thinking that God commanded, say, the driving out of the Canaanites or other severe things, these critics from within, people like Greg Boyd and Peter Enns, they will say, God didn't really command that. Even though it says, thus says the Lord, God didn't command that. That's just the fallen ancient Near Eastern authors, fallen, violence-prone perspective. And so he's mishearing what God says and falsely representing what God says to the people. They call those false prophets, by the way. That's not what's going on. And so so I'm pushing back against both of those views. But it's important to keep in mind, yes, the severity of God, but also the kindness of God. And so we'll look and see if we can't detect some of those themes here. Let's talk about the flood of Noah. If you want to read more of the background theologically, the ancient Near Eastern context and so forth, John Walton and Tremper Longman have written a very good book on this topic. As we talk about the flood of Noah, I'm not going to get into things like the extent of the flood. Is it global or is it regional? Geological questions related to the flood. Where does symbolism end and the historical begin, or vice versa? There's certainly a historical underpinning here. Gordon Wenham, noted Old Testament scholar, says the theological significance of the flood is more important than its date or extent. And if you're interested, you can look at a book that I co-edited called The Dictionary of Christianity and Science, which looks at some of these issues on the flood, on the historical Adam and so forth. So I would encourage you to take a look at that, a helpful reference book. But when it comes to the flood, one of the things that people overlook is that this flood is generated in the wake of God's sorrow. God, when he brings judgment, he does so reluctantly. Lamentations chapter 3 says that God does not afflict willingly. It's not as though God desires to bring affliction to people. It's often a matter of a last resort, when finally God says, that's enough, no more. And so we see that God is deeply grieved in bringing judgment. And so, a lot of times people, when they look at the commands of God, and sometimes they're severe commands, they think that God somehow enjoys issuing severe commands. He does not. God is often reminding the people of Israel that he doesn't desire the death of the wicked, but rather that the wicked turn from their evil ways and live. And he asks, why will you die, O house of Israel? So the flood account shows us God's reluctance after a period of time, after the building of the ark, after the preaching and so forth, that there is still violence and wickedness. And so God reluctantly says, that's enough. Secondly, God is simply finishing off the ruination and the disintegration that human beings have begun. So it's not as though there's just this kind of clean slate, everybody's doing great. No, human beings have already begun the destructive process. They're reaching rock bottom. And so God, rather than trying to rehabilitate, he simply says, that's enough. I'm going to start over with a clean slate, Noah and his offspring and so forth. So human beings had begun the damage. So God is not the one who is bringing the damage when everything had been pristine and fine. Thirdly, as we continue to read the Genesis story, the flood in Genesis 6 through 9, we also see the language of a new creation that is emerging. Rather than giving up on humanity, God says, I'm going to continue to work with humanity despite their failing, despite their violence, despite their wickedness. And so we see the language of the creation that is brought back into this narrative of Noah, where you have, think about it, you have Genesis 1, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, mention of the image of God. Genesis 9, be fruitful, multiply, mention of the image of God. You see that there is in the beginning, the Spirit hovering over the waters. During the flood, the dove is hovering over the waters. You see that there is this, walking, there's a walking in the garden. Adam and Eve are walking, in Genesis 3:8. You see Noah who is walking with God. And then there is this setting of a garden on the one hand, a vineyard on the other. There is sin that comes through the partaking of the fruit of that garden or vineyard. There is sin. There is nakedness. There is curse. But God is working to build a redemptive plan. God has not abandoned humanity, and so God begins again. This time, at the end of Genesis 10 and 11, we see a genealogy. One genealogy that leads to there's a division. Again, the name Shem, which means name. It divides up, and Shem's offspring go in two different directions. One ending with the Tower of Babel, where it says, where they say, come, let us make a name for ourselves. Then you see the other bifurcation going in another direction, where God calls Abram, who is also the offspring of Shem. Again, it means name. And God tells Abraham, I will make your name great. So rather than, let us make a name for ourselves, God's saying, again, graciously calling Abram and saying, I will make your name great. And all the families of the earth are going to be blessed through you. So there is this marvelous picture of God's redemptive plan going to all the ends of the earth. So God has not given up on humanity. God is moving forward. He is a missionary God and seeks to bring all the nations to himself. We also see that God is addressing the problem of a mutually murderous humanity. He institutes capital punishment, that if a man sheds blood, then by man that person's blood should be shed, because he's been made, that person has taken the life of someone who's been made in the image of God. So this is to prevent that downward spiral, the wickedness from continuing, to keep that in check through human government, through punishment and judgment, through the delegated tasks that governments have. Also, we need to understand that God is the gracious giver and sustainer of life, that God doesn't owe us a certain number of years. Whatever life we have is a gift from him. And so if God, as the book of Job says, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. That God is not under obligation to give us 70 or 80 years of life. So there's a certain distinction between us and God. We are not the authors of life, whereas God is. All right, let me just keep going here. Let's talk about the slaying of the Egyptian firstborn. We see in Exodus 11 and 12, we see that there is this event that is taking place, and we read in Exodus 12, now it came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And Hebrews picks up on this. By faith, Moses kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. Now, this is a common objection that people will raise. How could God do this sort of a thing? Well, as we'll see, for one thing, like I said, God is the author of life, that God is not obligated to give life. If he strikes down in judgment, that is God's prerogative. But let's say a little bit more about a few things in the backdrop here. Very interestingly, there was a mythological resonance with what we read in the book of Exodus prior to the time of Moses. This mythological tale, and you read these in various texts, the cannibal hymn, the coffin texts, and so forth. So it is the king who will be judged with him whose name is hidden on the day of slaying the firstborn. I am he who will be judged with him whose name is hidden on the night of slaying the firstborn. And it goes on the night of slaying the firstborn, on the day of slaying the firstborn. Looks kind of haunting, doesn't it? But here is something that precedes the time of Moses, but certainly would have been in the back of the minds of those who are in the land of Egypt. One scholar says these passages are strong evidence that a mythological tale once circulated in which some or all of the firstborn in Egypt, whether gods, mortals, or animals, were slain on a certain day or night. Such a myth may very likely lie in the background of the biblical account. So again, a kind of a preparatory sort of a thing for seeing the glory of God displayed. And God is often saying in the book of Exodus, "And they will know that I am the Lord." And as we look at who the Egyptians are, we see that this is the superpower of the day. And God is challenging the Israelites, the oppressor of the Israelites, Pharaoh, the leader of this superpower, to show his greatness. And he's showing this greatness, this God of the slaves, showing his greatness on the home turf of the Egyptians. As you read about the language of the firstborn, it's very interesting that a lot of people overlook the fact that the Israelites are called God's firstborn in the book of Exodus. God is saying that if Egypt is going to oppress God's firstborn, then God is going to bring judgment on Egypt's firstborn. So we read in 4:22 that God is preparing Moses to issue a command to Pharaoh to free Israel, God's son, my firstborn. And then the text goes on to say that he's threatening to take the life of Pharaoh's firstborn as representative of those in Egyptian households. So I said to you, let my son, or Israel, the firstborn, go, that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your, Pharaoh's son, your firstborn at the Passover. So the oppression has come to God's firstborn. And if Israel is not going to be released by Pharaoh, then he will have the judgment on his own firstborn as a penalty. We also see that, come back here, that life and death and the firstborn are connected to circumcision. Moses failed to circumcise his own firstborn son, Gershom. and this act needed to be carried out if Moses was to lead the firstborn of Egypt, the firstborn Israel out of Egypt, and was to serve as a model of Abrahamic, obedience. Again, fulfilling the covenantal sign that God had given to Abraham in Genesis 17. And so, if Moses fails in his duty, Gershom would be excluded from the benefits of the covenant community. So God, get this, would smite Moses if the situation were not remedied. So there is a pending judgment on him if he is not going to be attentive to his own responsibilities regarding his firstborn. So as with the Passover here, the shedding of blood, Gershom's circumcision preserved life, namely Moses's. So there's a lot of textual interconnection here, and you see that there is a theological theme that is being built. Key points to remember as we think about the firstborn of Egypt. God renders to Egypt what Egypt had done to the Israelites. You've done this to my firstborn, this will happen to your firstborn. Secondly, the enslavement of the Israelites would have required the involvement of a large population of Egyptians, and the Egyptians prospered because of the enslavement of the Israelite peoples, and the Israelites and other enslaved peoples as well. Keep in mind, Mark here brought up the question of God's hardening Pharaoh's heart. Well, keep in mind that even before Moses gets there, Pharaoh is already very nasty. It's not as though he's a really nice guy and then God hardened his heart and he turned really wicked. No, he was already pretty brutal. And again, I'll refer you to my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully, to look at the question of God's hardening Pharaoh's heart. But Pharaoh had already compounded the misery of the Israelites. Moses says, the Lord says, let my people go. He says, who is this God that I should obey him? He said, I'm going to make it tougher for you people. You're going to have to get the straw in order to make the bricks. That's not going to be provided for you anymore. So it becomes even more toilsome, more difficult. As I mentioned before, as with the flood, God is taking last resort action against Egypt. How many plagues had preceded this one? Well, 9. Still, Pharaoh continued to resist. Pharaoh continued to say no to God. And so God waits till the end and takes this last resort action, which finally resulted in the deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt. And even then, Pharaoh was going after them. So God in this picture is taking on the deities of Egypt. Exodus 12:12 reminds us that there is a cosmic battle going on here, that if the Israelites remain enslaved in Egypt, if they are not released, there is no redemption that comes to the world. So if there is no Exodus, there is no Israel. And if there's no Israel, there's no Messiah. And if there's no Messiah, there is no salvation. Something cosmic is happening here. And it's typified in the battle that the Lord is waging against the gods of the Egyptians. The salvation of the world is at stake. Let me move on to another divine smiting. And this is the striking down of Uzzah in 2 Samuel 6. So here's the passage. It says, when they had come to the threshing floor of Nakon, Uzzah reached out toward the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen nearly upset it. And the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down there for his irreverence, and he died there by the ark of God. David became angry because of the Lord's outburst against Uzzah, and that place is called Peretz Uzzah to this day. So, God hit the smite key. David seemed to think it was just arbitrary, that this was something that was simply a matter of God's capriciousness, and so he is angry against the Lord. But as we look at this event, there's a setup for disaster. So it's not as though everything was followed perfectly and then God intervened anyway and struck down Uzzah. No, there was a failure to obey the Lord from the very outset. So you see the events surrounding the ark's transport. Of course, Israel had a kind of warning label in the Mosaic Law. You've got to do this or else. And if you're dealing with holy things, sacred objects, you need to be especially attentive to your responsibilities. So there's a one rule for transporting the ark: use the ark's rings and poles. Exodus 25:14. You shall put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark to carry the ark. Now, again, very basic instructions here. You have the second rule, that the Kohathites had to carry the ark, not put it on the Kohathites' ox cart, but to actually carry this. So the Kohathite family members from the tribe of Levi were allowed to carry the ark, and they alone. And so ox carts should not be the mode of transportation here. And interestingly, David had commissioned this, but he should have followed the directions in the Mosaic law. Interestingly, too, Uzzah had been staying where the ark was temporarily housed. And perhaps we have another relevant circumstantial factor, that perhaps Uzzah had gotten used to the ark's presence and had lost sight of its sacred significance. You just kind of get used to it. There it is, kind of on display, and you just kind of move about. It's maybe something like, when you went to your first funeral. I remember when I went to my first funeral, I was probably about 4 or 5 years old, and it was a kind of freaky experience, and didn't really know how what was going on, but I mean, if you work at a funeral home, I mean, you're used to bodies in the funeral home all the time. You just get used to that and so forth. It's no longer something that perhaps frightens you or disturbs you. Well, maybe this is the sort of thing that's going on. Just the ark just hangs out there, and you just get used to it and treat it as a common object. But it's interesting that the Israelites failed to consider their own history in handling the ark. So what do we have here? We have in 1 Samuel 4:4, you remember the story of the battling against the Philistines. They carried the ark. The Israelites carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who sits above the cherubim. Notice how that's phrased. In the tabernacle, the cherubim, of course, are a part of the carving of the ark, and it's where the blood is sprinkled once a year on the Day of Atonement, in the Holy of Holies, in the most sacred place. And so this ark is turned into a good luck charm. Hopefully we can win in battle. We've got the Ark of the Covenant with us. Victory is guaranteed. But no, the ark was actually captured by the Philistines, and it brought plagues and troubles to the Philistines themselves. Curious Philistines who looked into the ark were struck down with a great slaughter. The Lord brought judgment upon them. We also see that the Philistines got rid of the ark, sending it back on a cart. Well, they didn't know better. They didn't have the law of Moses. But they put it on a cart, and it made its way back to Israelite territory, remarkably. And so David, who should have known better, has it put on a cart. And that's what the Philistines do. That's not what the king of Israel is supposed to do, who has the law of Moses. And then before Uzzah was struck down, the same somber words appear. Remember that? They carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who sits above the cherubim, 1 Samuel 4, battle with the Philistines. And now you have David arose and went with all the people to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the very name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned above the cherubim. So there's this very somber, very sacred pronouncement here, dealing with holy things. And then Uzzah is struck down. Also, letting the ark fall to the dirt would not have desecrated it. The human touch desecrates it, but falling to the dirt does not desecrate it. We also have the Israelites, who have a history of, if they get close to objects that are sacred and they are not prepared for it, then judgment falls. Aaron's sons, high priests, they offered up strange fire, an act of idolatry, and fire came from the Lord's presence and consumed them. And the Lord told Aaron, the father bereft of his sons, by those who come near me, I will be treated as holy, and before all the people, I will be honored. So as we look at these 3 acts of divine smiting, they reveal certain realities. The flood reminds us of God's grief and reluctance when judging sin. Egypt's firstborn, we see God's judgment is proportional. As you have done to others, so it will be done to you. As you have done to my firstborn, I will do to you. And that was too a last resort. Uzzah, God's punishment after ample warning and historical precedent, and the rule book, the law of Moses that gives instructions about how to transport the ark. All right, let's say something about the imprecatory Psalms. Psalm 137, C.S. Lewis, by the way. We had a discussion about C.S. Lewis, and I touch on a little bit of C.S. Lewis's view on these imprecatory Psalms. He thinks that some of these are fairly barbaric, that they are not really gospel-centered. They seem to fly in the face of the gospel. And he says, this passage is the worst one. So what is it? So it says, O daughter of Babylon, you devastated one, how blessed will be the one who repays you with the recompense with which you have repaid us. How blessed will be the one who seizes and dashes your little ones against the rock. Oh, a lot of people point to that one. That's their go-to imprecatory psalm to say, I have a problem with this. Let's talk about it. Oh, there's C.S. Lewis. Talked about the fanatic and homicidal Hebrews. Yeah, you might see loving one's enemy in Proverbs 25, but basically there's kind of a more cutthroat way of operating here in the Old Testament. All right, so I push back a little bit on C.S. Lewis. I don't like to disagree with C.S. Lewis, but sometimes you just got to in this case. But who are these little ones in Psalm 137? So we've got some basic options on how to understand those little ones. First is the little ones are Babylon's royal house. Look at this text. You've got the daughter of Babylon, which refers to Babylon's rulers. Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans. These are just your ordinary women living in in Babylon. This is talking about the royal house, the throne. And so the psalmist is saying, God, bring an end to the line of oppressors and tyrants. That's the upshot of that text, according to this first option. Some people say, oh, you're just making this stuff up. I mean, I'm following Old Testament scholarship here, so don't, you can look at my references too. By the way, all, the people in my, the endorsers of my book is God a Vindictive Bully say, all Old Testament scholars, well-respected scholars who appreciate the sorts of things that I'm bringing out and trying to put into kind of systematic order and give reasons and background to these troubling texts. Second option, little ones are Babylon's soldiers commissioned by the king. Here's Jeremiah 51. The daughter of Babylon is like a threshing floor at the time it is stamped firm. Yet in a little while the time of harvest will come for her. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, has devoured me and crushed me. So you see that association of the soldiers, crushing, the enemies. And so when saying, blessed is one who brings your little ones, dashes your little ones against the rocks, well, bring an end to those armies that tyrannize and destroy. That's the kind of emphasis that often gets overlooked in looking at this psalm. Option 3, it could simply be hyperbole, where there is extreme or heightened imagery that's not intended to be taken literally. And a lot of psalmists use exaggeration, and they're not expecting the readers to take this literally. Or it could simply be calling on God to bring about just recompense. So the psalmist is praying, just as they have treated others, so may they be treated. In fact, Isaiah 13 talks about the Babylonians who have dashed people against the rocks. And so saying, as they have done, Lord, do so to them. There's even a fifth option, that emotions expressed in the Psalms are not necessarily expressing these emotions with theological precision. So we've got going to give you a few examples here. So you have the psalmist venting but not necessarily being precise. So you have like in Psalm 22, you have, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, if you go to the rest of the psalm, you see that no, God has not forsaken him. In fact, when the psalmist is crying out to the Lord hears him. And so, or in Jeremiah 20, Jeremiah tells God, you deceived me, and I was deceived. Oh, is that really true? Well, no, that's just how Jeremiah feels. Don't stake a lot of theological precision on that charge, on that lament. God's forsaking his covenant, in Psalm 89 and so forth. So rather than holding the psalmist to theological accuracy in every statement that they make, there can be, again, a lot of the emotion that's being expressed doesn't have that kind of theological precision. Now, let me say something about mention of divine hatred in the Psalms. Aren't we supposed to, love the sinner but hate the sin? What's going on here? God hates those who do violence and so forth. Well, or in the psalmist says in Psalm 139, don't I hate those who hate you, O Lord? What's going on here? All right, well, one, hatred, when it's expressed, isn't necessarily always personal. It might simply be comparative, a way of saying loving less. Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. Well, it just means that God chose Israel. He passed over Edom, or Esau, in the choosing of a nation to bring blessing to the nations. I mean, God chose Judah, the tribe of Judah, through whom the messianic line would come, over, say, Joseph. But when you look at these characters, I mean, Judah's pretty, he's a scoundrel. He's not a person of good character. When you read the book of Genesis, Joseph is a more noble character. Not that he's off the hook. He makes mistakes too, but a more noble character than Judah. But yet, if you want to put it this way, God hates Joseph and loves Judah. He's passed over Joseph, and he has selected Judah. Also, when it comes to hate, it simply often expresses a zero tolerance stance against those who oppose or hate God. You're going to treat me as an enemy, I will treat you as an enemy. So that has that sense of opposition. God can love sinners, John 3:16, while at the same time his wrath remains on them, John 3:36. Also, Proverbs 24 and 25, Proverbs 25, we can love our enemies. Paul quotes this in Romans chapter 12. If your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him to drink. But Proverbs 24 talks about those, rescue those who are being dragged away to death. Hold them back. The requirement of just coercive force here that is required. So we can love our enemies, but also there may be the requirement of force to stop those who are bringing harm to others. Think of say, drug or sex trafficking, human slavery, and so forth. All those types of things. Also, when the psalmists are crying out to God and saying, Lord, strike them down, the psalmists are not taking matters into their own hands. They're asking God to act on their behalf. So this isn't vigilante justice that they're undertaking here, but simply saying, God, do what you must to bring an end to what is going on here, to the wickedness. Arise, O Lord, let not man prevail. Let the nations be judged before you. Put them in fear, O Lord. Let the nations know that they are but men. Now, interestingly, the psalmist in Psalm 139 acknowledges, after he said, Lord, don't I hate those who hate you? In other words, don't I treat as an enemy those who treat you as an enemy? Then he goes on to say, search me and know my heart. Try me, know my thoughts. See if there's any wicked way in me and lead me in the everlasting way. So there's this checking with God. Like in that Key and Peele video, substitute teacher, you better check yourself. Check yourself, check your heart. And we should be open to and rejoice in God's mercy on repentant sinners. We think of people who are, you think of Hamas, You think of what's going on in Israel. You think of all sorts of brutality that is taking place. But think about the Apostle Paul. He was at one time brutalizing, oppressing, putting to death believers in Jesus Christ. And we should always be praying for those who are enemies of God, that they would come to find reconciliation with him, forgiveness of their sins, and so forth. But there's also a place for praying for judgment upon the unrepentant. Even the redeemed, talk about, the imprecatory psalms don't go against the gospel. God says he'll render to everyone according to his deeds. And in Revelation 6, the martyred saints, they're redeemed. Their souls are crying out from under the altar, "How long, O Lord? How long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood that has been shed by those who dwell upon the earth?" There's the call for God to set things right, not to let injustice prevail. John Stott comments on Psalm 139, "We cannot desire others' salvation in defiance of their own unwillingness to receive it. This is the heart of the matter. We should earnestly desire the salvation of sinners if they would repent, and equally earnestly desire their and our destruction if they or we will not." Another so if we want to summarize what's going on with these imprecatory psalms, we want to kind of give three principles to it. Pray, have this mindset of, God, work in their heart or stop their heart, but examine my heart. So we see that's a kind of an encapsulation of what we see going on in the Psalms. Principles behind the imprecatory psalms: there's retribution. God, calling on God to bring about justice, to stop the vengeance. And in fact, we see in the Magnificat, Mary, who is, calling on God to bring low those who are high and mighty and are oppressing, and to raise up those needy from the ash heap, those who are humble, those who have been trodden down. Proportionality, God rendering to everyone according to what he has done. That's a basic principle. The eye for an eye principle is not literal, gouging out an eye if you gouge out another's eye, but it's basically a proportional thing, a proportional matter of justice. There's also the covenant. God says he'll curse those who curse his people, those who thwart the outworking of God's purposes on this earth. So we see these three themes, as we read the imprecatory psalms: retribution, proportionality, and covenant that are behind these imprecatory psalms. There are also imprecatory psalms in the New Testament. Jesus speaks with severe words, including language of curse, woe, in Matthew 23, for example, woe on Bethsaida and Chorazin in Matthew 11. Paul speaks severe words, including cursed language. Cursed is the one who preaches another gospel. And there are other voices in the New Testament that use this kind of language. Psalm 69, Paul quotes it in Romans chapter 11. It's an imprecatory psalm. Jesus cites imprecatory psalms. Peter quotes two imprecatory psalms, including one of the worst that C.S. Lewis, according to C.S. Lewis, Psalm 109. And so anyway, these are quoted in the New Testament. Jude 5. Our best manuscripts say Jesus, after he had delivered the Israelites from Egypt, destroyed those who did not believe. Jesus, a Christological view of the judgment on the Israelites in the wilderness. Jesus, after he had delivered the Israelites from Egypt, destroyed those who did not believe. Revelation 2:20, in red letters, Jesus says he's going to cast Jezebel down, and basically he's going to strike dead her followers. So this false prophetess. So we see that kind of severe language in the New Testament. I'm going to just finish with quotation. Truly persecuted and oppressed believers, John Goldingay says. I really think John Goldingay is the bomb. Truly persecuted and oppressed believers in other parts of the world may not find such psalms incongenial. African Christians have faced pernicious accusations of witchcraft which bring devastation, harm, and shame. Indeed, John Goldingay says, in places where enemies will use spiritual forces to bring harm to others through charms and recitations, Christians have come to see the imprecatory psalms as psalms of protection and defense. N.T. Wright, if there is injustice, if the poor are being oppressed, then it is right to pray that God will rid the world of that. Part of our reaction to the so-called cursing psalms is that we think the modern world basically has the problem of evil solved. The psalms bring us up short and say, no, evil is real, and some people, here it is, are so wicked that we simply must wish judgment upon them. Both Old Testament and New Testament affirm that. All right, we've got a few minutes for questions. In fact, how late are we supposed to go? Did I have an hour, I think, like till 9:30, right? Pardon? 30, okay, very good. Okay, so we'll take questions for you. Thanks very much for listening. Got a couple of questions.
Thank you, Dr. Copan. That was a wonderful presentation. My question revolves around actually the passage I mentioned at the start of your presentation, the passage from the Torah where an Israelite is found picking up sticks on the Sabbath, and the people bring him to Moses and ask, what are we supposed to do about him? And the Lord says, kill him. It's certainly a striking passage because just at the face of it, the punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime. God seems to be especially harsh here. And then if we look at the New Testament and how Jesus was constantly rebuking the Pharisees for how overly strict their Sabbath regulations are, and how Jesus and his disciples were kind of skirting the boundaries on that, it makes that story from the Torah especially striking. So what are some thoughts that you would have on how to interpret that and this especially strict punishment God seems to put down here?
Yeah, and I forgot to mention that one. I do look quite a bit in my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? At the nature of punishments in the Old Testament. And we do have two paradigm punishments, where there is capital punishment that is carried out. One is this one, the picking up of sticks on the Sabbath. Again, it was a violation of a known law, so it wasn't as though the person had no clue, there's no warning. Secondly is blasphemy, where someone is blaspheming the Lord's name, and in both those cases there is capital punishment that is carried out. One of the things that I mention is that, first of all, kind of like Ananias and Sapphira lying in Acts chapter 5, I think just lying about the money, what's the big deal? Struck dead. So there is some carryover in the New Testament. I talk about some talk about Herod being struck down in Acts chapter 12 for his impiety. We see that but Ananias and Sapphira are struck down right at the beginning when the early church is growing, right when things are starting out, and this sends reverberations throughout the community. That was a fearful thing, where the Lord acted in this way that brought judgment in a very sobering sort of thing. I think in the same way, in fledgling Israel's case, a nation is just starting out, and God is sending an actual, a warning. This is bad. Don't do this, and I'm going to remind you of that. But it's not as though, and this is one of the things that I've actually modified a little bit from my book, Is God a Moral Monster? And I've kind of shifted a little bit in my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? Where and again, a number of scholars have pointed out, as John Goldengay, for example, and others, that the penalties in the Old Testament were in the ancient Near East in general, when you see these harsh, severe punishments, stoning, and I talk about the woman caught in adultery. I talk about that text. Not the best manuscript attestation, but I still talk about it nevertheless. Was Jesus actually, what was going on in that passage? But generally speaking, things like adultery, which was typically stoned, you don't see people being taken to the judges after there's been adultery. You have a lot of adultery going on in the Old Testament, but that's something that's usually there's never a death penalty assumed here. It's like in Proverbs, Proverbs 5 through 7 and 9, and there's this assumption that there's shame that comes to the person who engages in adultery, that going to a prostitute and so forth, and that there may be some rivalry that's some contentious stuff that needs to be resolved between the two parties that are at odds. But it's not as though you just kind of go to the judge and then that you get your sentence. That just wasn't how things were handled in the ancient Near East. You'd have very strong hyperbolic punishments that were threatened to send the message: this is bad, avoid it, don't go there, don't do that. For example, in the Code of Hammurabi, you have a person who is a builder, and there's a warning: if the builder builds a house and it collapses, well, that person's son should be killed. Well, who's going to go into building if that's the case? I mean, you're going to risk your son's life being taken? No one would go into the building business if you had that sort of a threat hanging over your head. Or if a person botches a surgery, if the surgeon messes up, the patient's health, compromises it, well, his hand should be cut off. Well, who's going to who's going to go into surgery as a practice in Babylon if that's the threat? No, again, these were seen as strongly hyperbolic. People got the message, and they didn't really see this as being taken literally. Take a look. I mean, and I've spent 3 chapters on this in my book, "Is God a Vindictive Bully?" to bear this out. But that's generally how it was taken. That these were hyperbolic, stoning, burning, and so forth. It sounds frightening, but typically that was just not the case. In fact, in 16 potentially capital offenses, only one of them required the death penalty, and that was for murder. Everything else could be commuted to monetary payment, and that's kind of a general understanding of how that you pay for things that are non-murder related, for crimes that you've committed and so forth. So that's kind of a longish answer to your question, but would encourage you to take a look at the Vindictive Bully book. Got one. Okay, I'm gonna go to the back here, and then we're just gonna have to end with that. So sorry about that. Wish we had more time, but Addison's already had me in class, so he's heard me. We know each other well. So I'm gonna give someone whom I don't know to get an
first,
opportunity.
I wanna say thank you for the lecture. Very informative. Secondly, I just wanna ask. I'd like to change up the verse that I had a question on in the beginning. He actually inspired me. He said. Regarding Old Testament punishments, let's talk about Leviticus 20:13, right? Where if a man lies with another man, as he does with a woman, he shall be put to death. And his blood was their blood. Let's say here, it says their blood is upon them. So what regarding this? Old Testament smiting, what would you say to it?
Yeah, well, I see that as fitting in with that general, this is bad, don't do it, stay away from it. I mean, you do have, for example, I think this is what's going on in Genesis chapter 9, where you have Noah, and there is the uncovering of Noah's nakedness. By Ham, and that is probably a sexual act. But there's a curse, but it's not as though there's any sort of a lethal judgment brought or something like that. But again, I'd say that also fits within that basic category. So there's hyperbole, and again, that's something I got to talk about when it comes to not just punishments, but the warfare in the Old Testament. Highly hyperbolic. You see, it looks like man, woman, young and old, and so forth. Well, there is not this kind of utter destruction that is going on. There's a lot of hyperbole, and even when, I'll give you an example, and I talk about this in my Vindictive Bully book especially. But in Numbers 21, you have these 2 kings, Sihon and Og, who are. Israel wants to come passing through in peace. They're not allowed. These Amorite kings take arms and fight against them. And it says, the king, his sons, and his army fought against the Israelites. So they're going out to do battle with them. They're being aggressive. Well, no women or children here. It's just it's a battle between combatants. But you read Deuteronomy 2 and 3, which Deuteronomy hyperbolizes, exaggerates language, and it says about this same battle account. It says, "Man, woman, young and old, were wiped out." Well, no, it's just a combatant army fighting, being defeated. But again, that's the nature of the language. And look at 1 Samuel 15, the Amalekites. It's the same sort of thing there. The Amalekites have been allegedly utterly destroyed, but then you've got David fighting at the end of the book against an Amalekite army. So anyway, those are a few things to keep in mind. That's all we have time for. But thanks for listening. Blessings to you. Happy to chat afterwards.